Well, hey everyone. It is Chris Kubecka, the Hacktress, and I am going to read you an interview between myself and an Iranian citizen before the January 2026 internet shutdown. This article is called Before Iran Went Dark, the Last Conversation Before the Internet Blackout. An interview with an Iranian citizen recorded before communications were cut. This interview was conducted with an Iranian citizen in the days preceding the Iranian government's decision to cut internet access in January 2026 and restrict most communications nationwide. What follows is a first-hand account of events as they were described to me in real time before the country went offline. The interviewee's name is KT, and the interviewer is myself, Chris Kubechka. Steam with no release. The internet shutdown followed a convergence of crises which had been building for months. A sharp currency devaluation wiped out savings and salaries, leaving many Iranians suddenly unable to afford basic necessities. Sanctions had already weakened the economy, but the speed and severity of the collapse shocked those long accustomed to hardship. At the same time, a worsening water crisis exposed infrastructure failure that could no longer be ignored. By early January 2026, economic survival and access to basic resources had become inseparable sources of unrest. Economic pressure was not the only force reshaping public sentiment, as savings evaporated and daily life became more precarious. The exiled Iranian crown prince began to reappear more prominently in online discord, particularly among those searching for alternatives to the current regime. Whether viewed as a symbol or viable political figure, his renewed visibility reflected a shift in public mood. One of the final messages KT sent me before he went to join a peaceful protest and before communications went dark were videos of Reza Pahlavi. It was against this backdrop of economic collapse and growing fear that I spoke with KT. An interview with an Iranian citizen recorded before communications were cut. Days before the internet were cut, KT described what he had said was a raid by the government forces on a hospital in the western city of Ilium. Several similar reports were circulating from multiple regions at the time, although independent verification was becoming increasingly difficult as communications degraded. Believe it or not, he wrote, government forces raided a hospital and attacked people. In war, you wouldn't attack a hospital of the enemy. His message conveyed disbelief and alarm, as well as a deepening sense of disappointment with the regime. Interview. Chris Kubechka, me. In the days leading up to the blackout, what forms of regime violence were you personally aware of or hearing about? KT. Reports of violence were becoming more frequent and more alarming in the days before the blackout. He described security forces targeting protesters directly and said hospitals were no longer safe places. According to him, injured people were afraid to seek treatment, fearing arrest or worse. Political atmosphere and leadership. During the same period, KT shared reports circulating in Iranian and international media claiming that the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, had a contingency plan to flee Iran if unrest intensified. Whether true or not, the idea that leadership might run was part of the broader information environment shaping public perception. How do reports like this affect the way people around you viewed the regime at that moment? I asked. From KT, such reports reinforced the belief that the regime was afraid. Even without knowing whether the claims were true, the idea that senior leadership might be preparing an escape changed how people talked about the future. It made the regime appear weaker and less confident than before. On regime change and public expectations. When the conversation turned to the possibility of regime change, KT was notably cautious. I asked him, why do you think people are so careful about hope, even as protests grow? KT tells me, People had learned to temper their expectations after years of failed uprising. We get hurt every time we think we're there and it doesn't happen. We get crushed. Further creating, the repeated crackdowns had created a cycle of hope followed by punishment, making many people wary of believing that change was actually imminent. On the causes of the crisis. On the causes of the crisis, KT repeatedly emphasized that unrest could not be explained by a single cause. I asked him, "You told me that what's happening in Iran can't be reduced to one issue. What do you see as the main forces colliding right now?" KT emphasized that Iran's crisis could not be reduced to a single factor. He pointed to economic collapse, water shortages, sanctions, and rapid social change unfolding faster than institutions or society could adapt. In his view, these pressures were compounding each other, creating a situation where no single reform could relieve the strain. KT described the currency devaluation as one of the pressures pushing people towards the streets. He said the speed of the collapse was as stabilizing as the loss itself. Savings disappeared, wages lagged behind rising prices, and ordinary decisions became sources of stress. In his view, economic uncertainty combined with other crises to make daily life feel unsustainable. On the U.S. airstrike in 2025, I asked him, "How did people around you view the U.S. strike on Iran the last year, especially as protests intensified?" And he responded back that the 2025 U.S. strike was already part of the background against which people understood the current unrest. He described it as targeted and said many blamed the Islamic Republic for creating the conditions that led to it. In his view, responsibility rested with the regime rather than with foreign actors. Now, on the decision to protest, I asked him, "What went into your decision to go out and protest, knowing the risks?" Fear, he said, was constant, but so was exhaustion with the unbearable deterioration inside Iran. He described a sense that daily life had already become unsustainable, making the risk of protesting feel unavoidable rather than heroic. According to him, many people felt they had little left to lose. Now, on the potential U.S. intervention, I asked him, "What did people around you make of President Trump's comments about intervening if Tehran violently suppresses peaceful protests, especially given with what happened in Venezuela and against Maduro?" Now, KT said the international context was part of how people in Iran interpreted their situation. He noted that Trump's threat of intervention if the regime killed peaceful protesters, widely shared online, had two effects. He said many Iranians welcomed the idea of external pressure against the regime. On the other, it empowered people to document and share evidence of regime violence, believing that information could matter internationally. On Venezuela and Iran. For context, both countries have had a close personal relationship. The Iranian regime stated they would assist Maduro if something happened. The promises of aid did not materialize. I asked him, "Did what happened in Venezuela change how people in Iran thought about outside examples or resources?" KT explained, "The events in Venezuela gave many Iranian people a sense that entrenched regimes were not untouchable." He explained that this made Iranians more interested in understanding how information, documentation, and outside pressure could shape outcome, even if Iran's situation was different. He also told me that the U.S. action in Venezuela, including the capture of President Maduro, had created a sense of hope among some Iranians, not necessarily because they wanted military intervention, but because they saw that entrenched authoritarian leaders could be challenged and even removed. In his view, that sense of possibility helped fuel documentation and sharing of regime violence on social media and messaging formats and platforms. Now, looking ahead, despite the fear and uncertainty, KT also spoke about everyday traditions and what change would mean on a human level. I asked him if something meaningful were to change. How do people mark that moment? He explained that in Iran, people traditionally celebrate meaningful moments by giving sweets to those they love. He described it as a simple gesture that signals hope, a connection, a shared joy, even in difficult times. He hoped to share sweets soon with me. The last message I received from KT before the internet went dark read simply, "I'm heading out in a half an hour." I hope that was not his last message.